no problem with what order we do things or anything like that, because I'll probably take this and remix it. So, I've got lots of notes from the other tape that you made with us. See, now you were born in Salem, right?
Salem, Idaho. Mm-hmm.
What was your birth date?
February the 14th, 1904.
Okay, and you had how many brothers and sisters?
5 brothers and 5 sisters. I was right in the middle. I was the 6th child.
And name those brothers and sisters for me.
Uh-huh. Merle is the oldest. Elizabeth. And Leo Thomas. And then Mary, her name is Mary Kuntz now. Mm-hmm. And Angus. And then myself. And then Roscoe. He goes by the name of Ross all the time.
Where did Roscoe come from? Do you know?
I don't really know. But we call him Ross all the time.
Yeah, right.
And then there's Isabella. And Elva. And Morgan. And Grant.
Are there any special things that you remember about any of their births? Did anybody have any trouble or anything like that, or was it all just really smooth?
Oh, I think everything, that my second sister, Elizabeth, there was a little problem because her head was deformed, large, you know. Oh. And so I'm sure that was really difficult. But she was a beautiful person. She was really smart. She graduated from the 8th grade. And she played the piano. She could sit down at the piano and play by ear really well.
Now you do that to all your sisters? Mm-hmm. Have all your sisters done
No.
That? Just you two?
When I was young, there used to be a man come to the house to give music lessons. Merle took violin, and Leo took violin, and they all took piano. And when company would come, I didn't take lessons. The older ones did. Father would ask them to sit down and play some tunes, you know. Nobody would do it. But I remember I wanted to take lessons so badly. I'd sit down by the door of the parlor where they were, you know, having their lessons. And I'd listen to everything that this man said and try to remember it, you know. And so then I would get a piece of music and find out what key it was in, and then I would play it myself. That's the way I learned to play. And because they wouldn't, you know, respond when he would ask them to play, he said, "That's it. I'm not paying for any more music lessons." So after we moved to Sugar City, I wanted to take them so badly, and Mother told me if I would help her with the churning of the butter. We had quite a few cows, and she churned the butter with the big old barrel churn, you know. We'd get up about 3 o'clock in the morning, didn't have refrigeration at that time, and churn this butter, and Mother would mold it. She had a hand mold, and she'd mold about 25 pounds of butter, and we'd wrap it in wet towels, and we'd hitch up the old one-horse buggy, and I would deliver the butter around to the customers. To the sugar factory had a hotel, and we furnished butter to them, and then 2-3 local people, and they also took all the buttermilk that Mother had. So then Mother let me take 12 lessons. Got 12 lessons for $5. Then we moved to the valley, and Father didn't particularly like the man that gave lessons here in town. So that was the end of my musical career.
How come?
I really don't know what he had against him. He had a sister who lived here, and anything that she would tell Father was, you know, the right thing. Aunt Hannah didn't particularly like this man, and he's a great musician. His name was Driggs, James F. Driggs. And you'll notice in the songbook there are some of the hymns that possibly his father had written the lyrics to.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
In the tape we made before, you talked a lot about your mother and that milk, the buttermilk thing, how careful she was about that.
Oh, yes. She really was careful about everything. Had to be sanitary, but we had a hand separator. We used to have to turn that separator to separate the milk and cream, you know.
Yeah.
That was primitive, and that was hard work and took a long time, but that was surely good butter.
Now, you say you got 25 pounds of butter. How much milk did you have to?
I don't remember how much cream we would have to have for that much butter. I think that barrel was probably 5 gallons, that churn. And you couldn't have it full, of course. It would probably be 3/4 full, and didn't take too awfully long. Churn the butter.
You have a lot of good memories about Sugar City. Or how old were you when you moved to to the Valley?
The Valley, and that was in 1918. I was 14 years old.
So you spent most of your girlhood really down in Sugar City.
Oh yes, because I went in 1918. That fall I went back out there to school because they didn't hold school here in the Valley.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I graduated from the 8th grade and went 2 years of high school and part of the 3rd year. Then I came back and finished here at Teton High School my 3rd year.
And that would have been in
1919. 19 and 20.
So you would have graduated 2 years after Grandpa graduated then.
That's 3 years.
Because he was in the class of 1917.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any? Oh, I know what I want to ask you about. Other than your baptism, I want you to describe that baptism because that's really a great story. But do you have any other memories besides your baptism that really stand out from that time you spent down there?
Oh yes, I have a lot of memories of church, especially. I can remember the man that led the singing. I can remember that one man led the singing for years and years and years. And his name was Sweneman. And I can remember going to church in that church is gone now. We lived about 2 miles, and we used to go to church in the old white top buggy. Father put us all in this old white top buggy, and everybody went to church together.
After baths on Saturday night, huh?
Yes. It was a great time.
Did that, somebody that I was listening to talked about having to go up and stoke the pot-bellied stove at the church early in the morning on Sunday.
Oh, yes.
Did that church have that same kind of a thing?
No, I think they had a furnace of some sort, if I remember correctly. My throat gets so dry.
Would you like a drink?
No. I can remember the basement stairs. You know how kids will sneak down to find out what there is everywhere, you know. And I can remember that great, huge stove. Now, in all probability, it was maybe hot air. I don't know that they would have anything like that then. I really don't know, Eric. And it may have been steam heat, because I remember those big, you know, like dietas.
Oh, yeah, that's probably what it was.
Uh-huh.
That's probably right. You're probably right.
I don't remember very much about the church in Salem. I can remember where the church house was, but I was quite small, just in the 2nd grade when we moved up to Sugar City. And so I don't recall too much. I can remember the schoolhouse and going to school, things like that. But I can remember we wore woolen underwear in the wintertime, right to our ankles, and long sleeves, and black stockings. And I can remember the shoes that I wore when I was in about the 7th or 8th grade. And they came up above my ankle and they were buttoned. I can remember the button hook that we had, and used to button those with a button hook.
about that baptism.
Well, me being born in February, you could hardly get to the river, in February, and they didn't have baptismal fonts then. So it was in March. I'm not sure the date. I think it was around the 4th of March or something like that. But anyway, we went down to the river in the old blacktop buggy, a little single, just a one-horse buggy, father and mother and I. And there were some people that lived right down there by the river, and their name was Orem. And they had a daughter, Helen, who was my age. So Helen and I were baptized the same day. Her father baptized her. Mother, it was so cold, and there was snow all along the river banks, Teton River. And she put these long woolen underwear on me. I don't suppose they're all wool, probably just part, but I can remember they were sort of a grayish color. And she put those on me. So I've thought about it so many times. I can just remember Father walking down with me, hold of my hand and his arm around my shoulder, down to the water. And how frightened I was because it was so terribly cold. But I wonder sometimes if I really got wet all over. That ice cold water. But that's just like it was yesterday. I can remember that just as vividly. Sort of an overcast day.
In March.
Hmm. We didn't have any surfaced roads. It was all just dirt roads, and it was a little muddy going down there.
Yeah, that's super. That's a great story. See, now you talked about I guess there was a funeral at some point after you moved up here. There was a funeral that your father and mother went to?
That was Merle. My sister Merle was married to Ellis Wilding. And they had lost their first little girl, and then they had a boy. And she was pregnant with her second child. And her husband was building a dairy, he and his cousin, just north of Rexburg, that old gray cement building that you see there, still there. Well, they built that and started up this dairy, and he worked so terribly hard that he contracted typhoid fever, and he died. That was in September, after we moved up here in July. And Father and Mother and all the older ones, just Ross and I were left on the ranch out at Chapin to milk the cows. They went back out there to the funeral services and helped Merle arrange her things and come home back. She came to live with us afterward. But Ross and I were left to milk those cows, and I think there were almost 40 cows. We milked cows all day long. We wouldn't get through in the morning till it was time to go at night. I'd never had to do that, and it was really hard for me. And of course, Ross wasn't very old. He's a little over 2 years and 5 months younger than I am.
So you would have been, what?
12 and 14.
Oh, boy. And so Geen Hillman came?
Geen Hillman came from their ranch, just not far east and a little bit north of us. And he came down there and he says, I think you kids need some help. He was the greatest guy.
I don't know anything about Geen at all. I have never heard
Don't
anything
you?
about him.
He was entirely different. You knew Wendell.
Yes, I do.
He was sort of a short blonde. Well, Geen was a little taller and dark, had curly hair. And he was just so lively and full of life. At that time, he was going with a beautiful blonde girl that lived right east of our ranch, and that's how he happened to know what was going on at our place. And he and this girl used to come down and take me to dances out in the old Chapin schoolhouse. So I knew him quite well.
Chicken and noodles. Your mother used to make chicken and noodles.
Oh, yes. And I can remember in Salem. You probably have that in that interview about on Saturday night. Mother would put the old round tub up on the 2 chairs, and we'd get our weekly scrub. Father was over in the opposite corner in the kitchen with a coal oil lamp, and he did the chickens. He always had just 2 great big, probably red leghorns or something. And he took care of those chickens, and he didn't think anybody else could do it as well as he could. And Mother made homemade noodles, and she'd roll those just paper thin in round pieces about like this, and then put them on the warming oven and the oven door and all over the kitchen to dry. She'd do that on Saturday night, and then on Sunday we'd have chicken and noodles. Every Sunday that was our Sunday dinner, was chicken and noodles, with other things of course, but I have never tasted of them as good as Mother made them. I can't make them that way.
No, you had said that your father had, apparently his mother died when he was 17, something like that. And so
he was the oldest one of his father's, of the family. And of course his father was a polygamist. But Father was the oldest one, and he sort of raised the whole caboodle, really. And he was riding a horse. I don't know whether he was herding cattle, I can't just remember, but the horse threw him and dragged him. And his leg, that leg was crippled. Of course, they didn't get medical attention then like we do now. And Father always had a slight limp all his life. My father was a big man, big tall man, big stature.
He wasn't real high on polygamy either, was he?
No.
I've heard that from a lot of places.
No.
He kind of blamed the system for what happened to your family, to his family, and that.
I think so. It was hard. He didn't say too much about it, but and when his father became ill, he brought him home to our place. And of course, I was married, and my folks lived in Draper, Utah at that time. So they brought Grandfather Grover home, and Mother took care of him there. I don't know whether the other wives had died or just what.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about that at all.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It's in those histories. Your mother's got copies of.
He's not the Thomas. He's the Thomas who was the bodyguard, right?
No, it was his father.
And he and let's see, your father's name was Thomas
Martin.
And then his father's name was Thomas.
Thomas.
And
his father was
his
Thomas.
Father's name was Thomas, and that Thomas was the bodyguard. Okay. I didn't have that straight. I was one generation off. I thought I remember one.
No.
Okay, now you moved down here in what year? 18?
1918, July the 4th, we moved into the valley.
And at that time there was a flu epidemic, an influenza.
That fall, late in the fall, there was an influenza epidemic. Yeah, well, it was all over the country, but particularly bad in the valley. And there were some families lost 4 or 5 members of their family. Our family was all down, and my sister Merle and her 2 little children were with us. And Mother took care of us, and I'm sure she was just as sick as any of us, but she never did go to bed. But all the rest of us were down. And Father's half-brother took care of the chores, and none of his family got it. And he said the reason they didn't, they were so poor that they lived on bread and milk and onions. He always claimed that was the reason they didn't get influenza.
What kind of an influenza was it? What were the symptoms of it? You know, there's lots of different kinds of symptoms that come with the flu.
Oh, at that time, it was fever, high fever. and weakness. I don't think there was anything intestinal about it then, as I recall. But everyone was just terribly sick. I can remember, especially the men, the larger, older men. And Father, I remember, he and Angus, my brother, were particularly sick.
How long did it last?
Well, they didn't have any school in the valley, and they didn't hold church, and people that would go to the store for what they needed. They had the sheriff policing the town all the time. You had to wear a mask, just run in and right out. They wouldn't allow there was no one on the streets or anything.
How long were people sick when they got it?
About 2 weeks.
It was 2 weeks.
Before they were really able to get out. Bad colds and fever.
And so you went back out to Sugar.
Angus and Mary and I went back out to Sugar City, and Merle, my sister, had a relative that had an apartment right on Main Street, what they wanted to rent. So we rented it from them, and the three of us lived there and went to school. That was my sophomore year.
So you finished your sophomore year there,
Mm-hmm.
and then came back up and went to...
I went to part of my junior year in Sugar City.
How come?
Well, I went back out there to school and worked for my board at these Swindemans that I talked about. And they had a big family, a young baby, and I couldn't go to school and get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to help with all that work, and so I just came home. Then Mary and I, she taught school here in Driggs, and we lived together at downtown and in a home down there. We had a room, batched it, cooked for ourselves.
So you finished up high school and then...
No, I didn't graduate from Teton High School. When the fall came, before Evan and I were married, times were just really tough. Father said, I just can't afford to send you to school. And so I worked in the printing office, and Evan and I got married, and I took correspondence course, and my credits from here, they wouldn't give me credit for the music that I took in Sugar City. For some reason or other, that it wasn't allowed. And Sugar City would give me those credits, and it was 2 whole credits that I had. So by taking correspondence, I had to go out there once a month to take exams. I graduated, got my diploma from there.
After you were married?
Mm-hmm.
How did you meet Grandpa?
At a dance. He was a great dancer, and of course I liked to dance too. But I had gone with quite a lot of other fellows. But I met him at a dance.
Well, it sounds like there's lots of dances. You know, you talked about this, and Grandma Miner talked about this a lot too.
Oh my goodness.
Teutonia for dances. There were a lot
Yes.
of dances here, but sounds like there were just the big dances and stuff were in Teutonia. Is that right?
Well, there was what they called the Pines. It was out north and west of Teutonia. It's out east of Felts where the Pines. Someone had built this dance hall, and they sold hot dogs and hamburgers. But that was the big dance of the week, and there were just car after car after car went out there to dance on Saturday nights. But they had a dance hall down here, and then later it was the high school gym. But people danced then. Everybody, after a year of marriage, you went to dances for years and years and years. Now it doesn't seem like young couples ever go to dances.
We don't. Really dance very much.
Oh goodness, we danced. My girls would rather have danced with their dad than anybody they knew.
Is that right?
Yeah.
He was a good dancer.
He was an excellent dancer, just full of rhythm, Evan was.
I think I ever got to see him dance.
Then you probably didn't.
I don't remember ever seeing him dance.
Deetta and Larry particularly danced with her dad. I don't think the other girls did.
And so you met, and now you courted for like about a year, didn't you?
I met him in the winter time. We started going together, and we were going together in the winter when they were playing basketball, when they had their state tournaments. And it's really a bad winter, and the train didn't make it in. Of course, you couldn't drive out, really. And with the cars, people just didn't do that then so much, but they hired Evan of the 4-horse team to take the basketball team to Ashton to catch the train to go up to Moscow. They gave him $50 to drive clear out to Ashton. He left here about 9 o'clock at night, drove all night to get them there by 7 o'clock in the morning. And he was told, of course, they were all covered up with quilts, down in the sleigh, and he had to sit up and face the blizzard. It was really a terrible night. He said he just almost froze to death. But he got them there.
How did he ever find his way over there?
He was a great horseman.
That is really something. I had never heard that story.
Hadn't you?
No, that's a new story completely.
And then when Earl and Florence went out, and I think they were married the first part of April, Evan took them out to Ashton to catch the train to go to Salt Lake to be married to.
So then you and he had, now where were you married? I haven't.
Salt Lake, in the temple in Salt Lake.
I have never heard that story either.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything special happened there? Or you just
No, we went down alone. Nobody went with us. And we stayed at the New House Hotel. Evan had a room on one floor, and I was down about 2-3 floors. That big, of course, we thought then that was the hotel. And I had to get a written permission, for my parents because I was not of age. And I had to take this with me. I can remember how gray and cold it was. We walked from the hotel to the courthouse to get our marriage license. And then you'd go in at 5 o'clock in the morning at the temple. Get out. We got out just almost dark. And there was a little old lady, and I never did ever get her name, that helped me through. She was a sweet little lady. And we got out just as it was getting dark, and went over to the hotel and got our things and took what they called was a Bamberg. It was an electric train that went over to Logan. And it was just like riding on that cement step out there. It was so rough and hard. We were so tired. We were just dead from getting up about 4 o'clock in the morning. We took that over to Logan. And Evan had gone to the agricultural college, it was called then. And a lot of his friends were still in school, and 1 or 2 of my friends were there at school. So we went there and went to 2-3 dances, and there were some people by the name of Weaver, and they were a family of musicians. They had their own orchestra. They lived at Wellsville. That's just a little ways from Logan. And we called them, and they invited us over for dinner, and we went out and played for a dance. They had to play for a dance a little ways from there. And they had, I think, about 4 or 5 boys in the orchestra, and their sister played the piano. So she would get me to play one tune, and she'd dance with Evan, and then I'd dance with some of the boys. Then I'd play another tune for Fawn. Her name was Fawn. And that's the way we spent the night. It was so much fun.
Now, you did one other thing with you did 2 other things with your musical things that you did. You played in a dance band, didn't you?
Yes.
You had a dance band up here?
We called ourselves the 4 Aces. And there was my brother Grant and Morgan, Vaughn Floyd, Dean Wilkie, Milo Daly, and I. And Morgan made the stands, had the 4 aces on it, and I showed you one of those pictures. I think it's in there. And we went over to Jackson, played, and we played up at Victor, and we played in Teutonia. We didn't make any money because by the time we bought music and paid for our gas, but we had a good time.
Yeah, Renee does something like that with their singing group.
Mm-hmm.
They have that, and they use their money to buy equipment and stuff.
Yes.
Just do it for fun.
But we, in high school, Evan's sister Merle took a lot of vocal lessons, and she sang the soprano and I sang alto, and we sang together beginning there in 1919. Then later we sang in a group we entered a contest. They used to have church contests, you know, for double mixed quartets and ladies trios and sextets. And so Mrs. Elaine Sewell and Merle Sewell and I, all 3 sang alto in this sextet. And somebody came up here and put on what they called a chautauqua. Have you ever heard of a chautauqua? Well, they used to come to town. They had all kinds of music, and they usually followed a script, sort of a, you know, not like an opera really, but sort of. And they wanted a lead singer. I started singing soprano then. So the 2 Mrs. Sewells and I formed this trio and began singing, and we sang together for 37 years. We sang to the dedication of the Idaho Falls Temple, the dedication of the funeral home in Idaho Falls, or in St. Anthony. We sang all over the country. I went to Salt Lake and sang to 2-3 funerals as a soloist. And we went to West Yellowstone. We sang for the school programs and went around on Memorial Day. They used to, as the American Legion goes around, have you ever been there when they had their little ceremony? We would sing a trio. We 3 ladies. We did that, and we sang for funerals mostly, but a lot of civic things that we sang for. Give a lot of service. The only time that we were ever offered pay, or anyone ever offered to pay us, there was a man died, and in his will he had left money to pay for this group to sing to his funeral service. But the man that was the bishop would not let us take the money. And so we did. Of course, that was all right, I guess. I don't know what was they used the money for, but we sang at his service. We bought our own gas and paid our own fare. It was rendering service.
And you also played piano at the movie theater.
Oh, yes. And when we lived in Sugar City, and I was so small. But they used to have these serials that they call serials. You know, they went on week after week. There was the Purple Diamond and a lot of titles like that, you know. And I'll tell you, they were just hair-raising. And I'd sit there with that piano at an angle where I could get the story, and I would play all afternoon for my show ticket, and the tickets were 5 cents. And then up here, they had a theater in the old Beasley Hall, and Jess and Fred Driggs ran the theater, and I played. They'd have 2 shows at night, you know, and I played through both of those for $1.50.
What? That doesn't sound. Now, when was this?
Oh, that would be in 1921 or 2.
So $1.50 really wasn't too bad of money then.
Oh, no, because a lot of men that were only making $1.50 a day.
Yeah.
we worked out at the power plant. Evan and I cooked, and he worked as a laborer. You know, they were building the tunnel through there to the power plant, and he made $1.50, and I made $2. And shoes cost you $9 a pair. I can remember I bought a pair of shoes, and they cost me $9.
You know, after you were married, did you still work at the printing press after you were married?
No, they closed that for a while. Mr. Madsen was quite ill, and he left and went to California. And it was closed. No, I didn't work there. Didn't work after I was married.
After you were married, from the time you were married for quite a while, there's a real interesting string of jobs that you and Grandpa did. And I've heard, you know, bits and pieces all over. Could you kind of lay those out for me? The different things that you did up through the mine and...
Well, we worked out at the power plant. We didn't have any children then. And we lived at Pratt Ward a winter. That was when Larry was really young. And we worked at the coal mine when Larry was a baby. Evan worked in the commissary and then up at the old mine where they... And we lived there then. And then right after that is when Evan worked with those mules on the highway down here. And Dieta was born here in Driggs. And then when Lola was a baby, we went back to the mine. We moved up there. And we lived there then until 1931. That was 4 years. Lived right up there. Till just before your mother was born, we moved down to Driggs.
I didn't know you lived up there that long.
Yes. First time we lived up there, and Larry was small. I guess we lived up there just the one winter. Probably 2 summers and 1 winter.
And you had a cabin up there?
Yes, we had a cabin then that was over close to the commissary on the west side of that creek. And then when we had the 3 girls, we lived up on the hill on the east side of that creek.
There's not any of that left up there anymore?
No, there's not a house or anything.
No, there's just hardly a sign at all. Anything that's ever been there except for the slag pile.
I imagine they must have had over 100 miners.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, you'd hardly know it.
No.
You don't have any idea. It just looks like a meadow.
Yes.
Now, and that was in 30?
That was from 1927 to 31.
Now, those were Prohibition days, right?
You know it.
And those guys up there were not Prohibition.
They had their own still, and they were most of them were either foreigners or from Butte, Montana. And the group from Butte, Montana, they were the partiers. Good miners, but they're quite a rough bunch.
Were they? Were they good miners?
Oh, you bet. Yes.
That's interesting. I hadn't ever really thought about that. Those guys are really very good at their jobs now, but...
Up there at that time, they used to have dances up in the schoolhouse. They had a nice schoolhouse up there. And I used to play the piano for those dances. And we'd put Larry to sleep on a bench. And Evan, of course, would dance. And Mr. Beckstead that played the violin, he'd play the violin and I'd play the piano. They dance all night. And Ace Wood, the girls know him, your mother would know him. But he called for the dances. Of course, they were mostly square dances, you know. So I played here and there and every place.
Now, the impression that I've always had is just a bunch of miners living up there. That doesn't sound like that's right. There must have been...
Oh, they had families. There were practically all of them, excepting the Romanians and those Slavs, and some of those men had families. But Mr. Pinter that built this old house right here next to me lived up there, and he had a family. His wife died, but there were all those houses, practically every house. The men that didn't have families ate at what they called the cookhouse.
And you cooked?
No, I never did cook.
You just stayed over at the power plant.
I helped with the music at the mine in the school.
Now, this is the first time? This is the second time you went up there?
That's the second time.
This is the second time. When Grandpa was working up there the first time, had you had Lurie by the...
Just Lurie,
Just Lurie.
She was small.
Now, is that the time that you were staying in the little hut when they were blasting? Is that...
No, that's out to the power plant.
Oh, that's the power plant. Oh,
That's
okay.
out the power plant
Okay.
when they were building those turbines, out there.
And you got to tell that story too.
Oh, Mr. Jepson, he was desperate, I guess, when he came and asked us to come out and wanted me to go out and cook. And he was really good. He tried to help me and I could have anything I wanted to cook with, but I didn't know how to cook for a group of men, and there must have been 15 men. And there were rattlesnakes, and there were rats. And I just lived in fear all the time. At night, I don't think I got a wink of sleep for a week up there. Evan would put a rope around our bed so the snakes wouldn't go over the rope, which was a crazy idea. But one afternoon, Evan said, when you get through with your dinner work, come over where we're hauling rock. Anyway, they were hauling in a boat across the river and building the tunnel, through the mountain. And so there was a man from Driggs who was out there, and he was sick. And he was going to walk over with me, and he said he didn't hardly feel like it. But I started out, and he got worried about me and followed me. He killed a rattlesnake behind me. He didn't tell me till the next day. But Evan and his cousin, Leland Allen, were in this boat. And when this fellow was blasting, there was a rock about that size come down right between them and went right through the boat. But that day that I went over and met Evan, we walked through the tunnel and back to the mine. And it thundered while we were in that tunnel. I thought the whole mountain was coming in. But this man used too much dynamite, and he would have his wife and I go out to a little old log cabin and stand in the corner when he'd set off this powder. Anyway, I had had about all of it I could take, and Evan didn't like me out there anyway. So I went home, quit, and this lady, this man's wife, wanted to cook anyway. She wanted the job. And I went home, and the next day we set off a blast, and she went out there, and the rock came through and killed her.
Did you go back out?
No, I never did go back.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So we got you there, and then you went out and you worked 1 year at the mine, and then Grandpa worked on the highway?
Yes, he worked on the highway, and then he worked on the thrashing machine. They used to go around from farm to farm thrashing the grain. And he worked for Charles Daniels. And he was working out there when Dieta was born. Whitney, the morning that she was born, Whitney went out and got him, and he came in and went back out, didn't miss any work. Was home for the Dieta. We had our babies at home then. And he did that for about 2 or 3 years, I guess, that he worked for that man, and for the fall harvest, and worked on the road. just about anything he could find to do, he did.
And then he went back out to mine?
Yes, that was after we had Lola. But he worked on the road in between the time that Dieta was born and Lola was born.
Now, when you had Lola, you had appendicitis, didn't you?
No, Dieta.
Oh, that was with Dieta?
Yes, in March I had, that's the reason we left the mine, is because I became ill. And I came down, the hospital was down here on the next street. And then we rented a house and stayed in town. And we lived in town until after Lola was born. And then Evan got this contract to haul a mail, a Star route to Sam. And we moved back up there.
So rather than living here, him going out there and hauling mail.
Yes, because he had to bring the mail from here to Driggs and then go back.
I see.
If he'd lived in town,
I
had to make an extra trip.
I see. I know. I hadn't known that. I always thought he lived here and just hauled stuff up there.
No.
What he'd do then is he'd bring a load of coal and the mail or whatever, or is it just the mail?
Mostly the mail, and then groceries. They hauled groceries for people, and for the commissary, the cookhouse, he hauled their groceries up.
Now is that where that picture, that photograph is that I have of you and your friend? Is that during that time? And that's and he did that for a while, and then he got another job at something.
He went into Yellowstone Park working with his horses on the Lewis River road over there.
And it was during that time that you drove the team back and forth?
I drove the car.
Oh, you drove
Model
the
A car, Ford.
And then how did you hurt your back?
That's when Lola was born. We were coming down. My brother was going on a mission. It was late in the fall. And a lady was sitting on the seat of the stage. I think there were about 4 or 5 seats. Evan, of course, was driving the horses. He had 4 horses on this stage. And I don't remember that he had any passengers, only us. And there was a Mrs. Frederickson was on the seat with Lurie and Dieta, and I had Lola on my lap. And as we went through the ditch, and the wagon, the horses, the wagon sort of stops and then starts up quick, and the seat broke off. And I just went end over end off and sort of pulled her to one side so I didn't hurt her. That's when I kind of broke me up a little. There weren't any surfaced roads. It was a terrible trip to town. The winter was heaven because the roads were frozen, but in the springtime especially it was really rough.
Now was that toward the end of when he drove that route, or was it?
Yes, it's toward the end because his contract was up in, I drove it for about, I think he left here in May, and it was up the 30th of June.
And then you went ahead and moved on up to Yellowstone?
Went over into Yellowstone. Lola had what they call a congenital hip, and we took her to Salt Lake to have her hip operated on. There was a Dr. Brown that did the surgery.
How old was she?
She was 6. And we didn't know until she started walking, that she would limp. And at that time, they didn't put a new hip in or anything. They just tried to get the ball back in the socket, and she was in a cast. Her leg was out just like this. She lay on a bed, and her feet would hang out on both sides. And we took her to the Children's Hospital in Salt Lake. And the doctor said she should get out. She'd been in the hospital most of the winter, and we should get her out into the fresh air and sunshine. So we packed everything up and went over there to live with them, and we lived in a tent over there at Lewis River. I know right where the spot is now. Yeah. The Butler brothers had the contract, and Evan worked for them. It was quite an experience. Cook your food in the ground, you know.
For a long time.
A month. We were over there a month.
Oh, you were just there. You know?
Uh-huh.
You had some pretty interesting sleeping arrangements there.
Oh, mercy, yes. We had made these beds out of pine boughs, you know, and the little girl slept in one bed, and Anne, your mother, would sleep with us. And Evan slept right by the door of the tent, and this old bear used to come snooping around in the night, and he had a big quaking-ass club, and you could hear that old bear just grunt when Evan would hit him with that.
Had he step out and hit him with it? Or?
No, he just reached down. He had it right by his bed, and he'd just give it a throw and hit him. And he'd go on his way. He never did bother us in there, but we used to have to put our meat in a gunny sack, and then they would put a pole between, or the rope between two pine trees, you know, and string the meat, hang it up there so the bears couldn't get at it. It must have been really good to hang out there in the sun. I don't remember. I think we had mostly ham. We didn't try to keep fresh meat.
And then you said on that other tape they had a bear that was giving them trouble with their lunch boxes, too.
Oh, yes. They used to raid their lunch pails up on the road where they were working. And so they kind of made a trap for him. I think they put some powder in this lunch box. He got to snooping around and sort of got his nose burned, I guess. Evan tells about it, and he tells about how they got such a kick out of seeing that old bear go screaming off. Didn't kill him, of course. But
no, yeah, but that was in your life. And they couldn't carry any guns, right?
no. You couldn't take a gun in the park at all. They were working up there, and they had all these big, long crowbars, you know, that they used in their work. And one of them was hitting in the rocks with this crowbar. And there was a place in the rocks, I suppose, you know, just a cliff or something in between. Anyway, he came down with that crowbar, and there was no bottom, and it just went down. And they said they never could hear where it went, and they couldn't reach it or anything. But the way they worked over there used to frighten me, because the machinery they used was so primitive. You probably have never ever seen anything about these levelers and things that they used. Hard work. When we got through, the butler brother said we didn't make any money, so we don't have any money for you. Evan had worked all summer for nothing.
Did they give him any money during that time for any food?
$25 when we went to get Lola out of the hospital. I worked in the post office and worked in the pea shed and different things to try to help out. But that was in the 30s, early from 31 on, and you know what the economy was like at that time, depression.
So then he came back here and he had another real good experience too, didn't he?
Yeah, the oil wells, hauling for the oil wells, and he irrigated for Jim White, and on payday Jim would conveniently always be out of town. They made $3.25 a day irrigating, 12 hours a day. Evan was real good at irrigating. He could always get work irrigating. So we had some good experiences. Not so good, but then.
Educational. And then you went. It was about this time that you went to work for the government, wasn't it? Oh, this is.
In 1940, we moved up here in '39 to this house, and in 1940, I took an examination and took the population census and the farm census. I had the Driggs area, and then I recapped the county for them. they called me and asked me to recap the county. And that's the money that I used to put in our bathroom. The fellow that had gotten the loan to build his house had used the money for his bathroom. And the furnace, he hadn't paid for the furnace. We had to pay for that when we moved in here. So I made enough money for the census to put the bath in. And then I took the census in 1950, too.
I didn't know that.
Uh-huh. Done a lot of things. And in 1940, Mr. Hastings, Luke Hastings, was the county auditor. He asked me to come down and help him out in the office down there. So I went down there, and he said he needed me for 2 weeks. So at the end of the 2 weeks, I thought that was it, and I kind of had the flu. And I didn't go back, so about Wednesday of the 3rd week, he called me. He said, where are you? Why don't you get down here to work? And I said, well, you told me 2 weeks. And that was at the time they started the registration for the draft. So he asked me if I would take that job. I didn't apply for it, he asked me. So that's when that began, and in 1942, we had to qualify for civil service. So they called me one night just before 5 o'clock, said, be over in Jackson at the Forest Service office at 8 o'clock in the morning to take your civil service test. I took 2 of the girls with me, left here at 5 o'clock in the morning or 6, something like that, and drove over there and took that 4-hour test. Girls played around while I was in there. It was so cold. It was May. And in that book of mine there is the result of my test. I got 89, and I hadn't been in school for 20 years. And then I worked for them for 32 years.
Oh, it's during that time you had Marcia, wasn't it?
Yes,
Everybody, didn't you?
Nobody knew. I needed that job very badly. And started out at $90 a month. And we were paid according to the registration in the county. And I have all my performance ratings and everything in that book, showing the raises that I would get. Kept all that stuff. That was a great job. My goodness, I had lots and lots of trouble with parents. Not too much trouble with the boys themselves, but I suppose if I'd had a son, I would have felt the same way that they did. But
The boys are willing to go, huh?
most of them, they didn't want to, of course, but
Yeah.
we had lots of volunteers. But I kept a list of all the boys that went into service, and I turned that over to church. They have that, I hope, somewhere.
Do you have any idea how many of the boys that went into the service during that time came back?
Well,
How many?
I think there were only 14 in the valley who lost their lives in World War II. There was one boy in Vietnam that was killed.
I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the boys just go in the Army.
No, we had Air Force and a lot of Navy personnel. And one fellow that went in the Merchant Marines. Of course, the Merchant Marines at that time, you didn't get service credit for that. They made good salaries. And there's one that I particularly remember. We didn't have very many conscientious objectors. I remember I processed one fellow that refused to go. By the time they got through with him, he decided he would go.
Is it?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I had a file that thick on him.
And you talked him into it, huh?
Well, it goes, they are assigned to work duty, they'd have to work. And we had a few of those that would go to work, civilian work. But this fellow particularly, he just refused to do anything.
During the time that you were working in the pea sheds, did your wisdom teeth pull, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I worked in the post office all day. 5 o'clock, I went up and had my wisdom teeth pulled, and then I worked all night in the tea shed. So I don't know what we made an hour, probably about 25 cents. I know we didn't make very much in a shift. It'd be about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when we'd get them all sorted.
It was about that same time that Grandpa went to work for the Soil Conservation Office?
Mm-hmm. Oh, let's see. I'm not sure of the years that he worked for the Soil Conservation. He was their office manager here for quite a long time. Then politics changed, and the county Republican committee, of course, everybody went in. Evan was sort of a half Democrat and half Republican. Anyway, they didn't rehire him. And so at that time, he went to work on the highway, or the roads, you know. Drove that heavy machinery till he was 67 years old.
And that was when he was moving snow
Mm-hmm.
and drive dump truck.
Mm-hmm.
Till he was 67.
He worked till he was 67 years old. And there's so many men now, they think when they're 60 years old, they can't do it anymore. They can't do anything. And here he was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and going out and opening roads so they could get school buses through.
Now, when did he become Justice of the Peace?
In that book of mine there, when I made that civil defense book, when I made that book up, he was a judge then.
It's not really...
No, I'm not sure of the year. I retired in 1973. It must have been about 62 or 3.
So he was doing that at the same time that he was
working on the road. And he only had to work so many hours a day at that. And I had an office up in the courthouse, and just across the hall from the county agent, and the county agent worked right with him on this.
How did he get involved in that?
Oh, he and Wayne got to talking one day and decided that all the young people were leaving the valley. There was nothing for them to do. There was no recreation for kids. Don Penfold had started a little ski area up by Victor, but it really didn't go. And there was a group that had investigated this Fred's Mountain, knew that it was a good mountain, and they formed a profit-making organization. But of course, the Forest Service wouldn't give a lease to anybody. It had to be non-profit. Anyway, Evan and Wayne investigated this, and they went all around the valley and counted how many empty homes there were, people leaving. They had to leave for employment. And that's the way they began that, he and Wayne. And so then they had to make a feasibility report and so many details. You just don't have any idea what the stuff that they had to get together before they could even ask for anything.
Yeah, they worked and worked and worked.
The employment security didn't want them to do this. They worked against them on it.
Oh, really? How come?
I don't know really why. And they had to use men that were on the unemployment roll.
Yeah, building that road back up there, huh?
Well, they had to clear the brush. They cleared it one year, and the next year they built the road. Then they struggled for the money to build a resort.
Fighting everybody.
paid his own expenses to Boise. I don't know how many times we went to Boise. He went to Seattle and Ogden.
How did you feel about all this?
He was happy, and I felt like as long as he was doing something he liked and he was giving service to the people, trying to create something, that I went along with him. I didn't ever.
This is after he retired, wasn't it?
Yes, I didn't ever object to that. He met so many people, made so many friends. He had friends all over the world.
I know that everybody that I've ever talked to liked him.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever come across anybody that didn't like Grandpa.
The Forest Service would not do business with anybody but Evan. Any of the directors or anybody.
Grandma, that's all the questions I have.
Good.
Are you getting tired? How are you feeling?
I'm okay.
Yeah. Unless you have any little tidbits or stories that you'd like to add in?
Oh, I don't. No, I've been busy all my life and worked hard. And I would like to sell my house because of the work.
Yeah.
Not that I don't like to do it, Eric. I love to do it. I love the yard work, but it is terribly expensive.
Yeah.
It's terribly expensive to keep up this house, and you don't get any younger, you know. You just keep on getting a little older, a little tireder.
Is that right?
But I do like yard work. I can be lonely and depressed and all uptight inside and go out there and start digging, and I forget all about all of it. I'm relaxed as I can be. If I had the strength to do it, I'd never give it up. I may not give it up because I may not be able to sell it, but we'll just have to see. The girls have been so wonderful to me. They are so good. They call often. We used to write, but I got lazy and they all got lazy. So we call each other. They have been so wonderful to me. Every one of them. That I don't know what anybody would do without a family. But I don't regret any of the service I've given. I look back and I've done a lot of civic work. I was chairman of the American Red Cross. I was the production chairman during the war. And we made just hundreds of pieces of clothing, sweaters, and we got wool material through the government. And then we made dresses for the refugees, you know. Mailed big boxes. There was one little old lady who was crippled here in the valley, but she used to make little sewing kits. You've seen them probably that you have. She rolled them up, and we sent one of those to every boy that was in the service. And then I was chairman of the Cancer Society for a number of years. And I was director of civil defense for 10 years. Wrote their disaster plan. There's a copy of it in that book. I don't regret any of it. I'm really glad.
That's super.
Keeping myself busy and that I'm able to take care of my own. It was not a traumatic experience as far as taking over, taking care of property and Evan's affairs after he died. It was no problem at all for me because I'd been aware of how you did things. And if you don't use your mind, you don't have one.
Yeah, that's right. You'll atrophy. Now, last night you told me that story about when Grandpa died. Would you tell me that again? About how
Yes, Evan had had this prostate operation about 10, 12 years before. And just in a little routine examination, the doctor found a little sign, a little lump, and they did a biopsy, and it was malignant. So they operated, and they said, we think we got it all. But he had 10 years before he got sick, and we went out and had a GI series, and then he did the biopsy, the doctor out there in Idaho Falls, and said it was carcinoma of the stomach. And he said it's up to him whether or not we operate. And Evan says, get it out. So they did the surgery. And of course, Evan never did ever come out of that, really. He was in surgery quite a long time, and oftentimes an older person, their mind, he'd remember for a little while and then he'd forget. But we kept him home here until, about 5 or 6 weeks after the operation. And we took him to the hospital, and he was in a coma. And Larry came up and stayed, and she would stay with him at night. She and Dieta took turns. And then I would go in the daytime. And all the girls, your mother had been up, Ann had been up when he was in the hospital before he went out and had that last surgery. And he told Ann he knew he wasn't going to make it. He had the premonition he wasn't going to make it. She never did tell me that till afterward. But he was real ill there in the hospital. And Ann had come from Boise. She flew in that day, and she had been over there, and we came home, and Larry called and said, I think we should have a prayer. So we hurried over to the hospital, and Marcia had just gone home. And we made the circle there, and I called it Grant, my brother Grant. He and Evan are the best of friends. So he came up and gave this prayer, and Evan, I could just feel him, he just slipped away. But we called in to try to catch Marcia. She didn't want Kevin to come in and see Grandpa when he was so sick. And the sheriff over in Swan Valley met her right there on that Swan Valley Bridge, and he stopped her. And he nearly frightened her to death, and he said, would you step out of the car? She said, I wasn't speeding, I wasn't doing anything wrong. And he says, will you please step out, Mrs. Berger? He didn't want to tell her in front of Kevin. And he told her, and then he piloted her over here to the house. And Lola was in Salt Lake. That was at the time that Jeff, had been hurt so badly. And they were in Salt Lake with Jeff. And she flew home. Got here just the next morning, I guess. Well, Larry had been here 5 weeks. She had just taken a leave of absence from her work, and George and Bob had been getting along without her. When I got hurt, your mother was right up there to Idaho Falls and came home with me. She must have been with me a month. So the girls have really and truly been wonderful. And their husbands too.
That's a good bunch of men.
They really are. Evan didn't have any sons, but he thought just as much of those men as he did if they had been his own son.
You'd have a hard time finding a better bunch of men.
That's right. Yeah, and the girls are all secure. They're all well cared for. All got good homes. And we're so blessed that we have such a wonderful group there now. There are about 70 of us, or more now. About 71, I guess. And everybody is well and happy. the boys, the grandsons, so many of them have been so successful, got wonderful jobs and good educations. I'm surely proud of all of them.
Well, thank you very much, Grandma.
You're welcome.
I appreciate you sitting and taking the time. I know you've done it lots of times.
Oh, that's okay. Imagine you're tired. You've had quite a day.